Hello everyone, welcome to Thread Tech Tuesday, and this week we are going to explore my very favorite stitch, the straight stitch or running stitch. And I I think it's one of the unsung heroes of the stitching world. We tend to focus on the fancy stitches, but you can do so much with the running stitch or the straight stitch, and really they're the same thing. Straight stitch is one stitch and a running stitch is multiple stitches. Um, so it's the same thing. But like here's an example of just changing the direction that I'm stitching, and I think it's such a versatile stitch. So to get started, one thing I want you to avoid is this. You do not want to stitch like this. This is called stab stitching, and it's very difficult to get your stitches to land where you want them. And it's actually twice as much work on your hands. So in order to save your hands and move a little quicker and really get into that wonderful rhythm of the straight stitch, you really want to load multiple stitches onto your needle at one time. And I use this stitch primarily when I'm doing my stitch meditations. If you go and look at a handful of them on my Pinterest page or my Instagram, you will see that they are almost all straight running stitch. It's just such a wonderful stitch to get into a rhythm. And one of the things I like to do is stitch it in patterns. So here I've got 5 lines stitched together, stitched next to each other. They just create a lovely pattern, and I love how it changes the texture of the fabric when you stitch them like that. Now, the other thing that I do is what I call my railroad tracks. And it's really the straight stitch stitched next to each other. So I think some people call this a ladder. It's not really a ladder stitch. A ladder stitch is something completely different, but it looks like a ladder. And it's just makes a lovely pattern, and it can be used to embellish the stitch with other stitches. But I just like it by itself. I use this quite a bit when I'm joining two fabrics together, not as the join, but kind of as a decorative element. And the other stitch that I like to do with on my meditations and in general stitching is a scatter or seed stitch. Some people call this chicken scratch. There's so many names for this, but really ricing is a name. It looks like scattered bits of rice across a surface, or you could call it pine needles, tiny pine needles. And the hard part about this is that you're trying not to have it create a pattern. But since we are human, we tend to create a pattern just automatically. So you have to think about it a little bit so you don't just create a pattern accidentally. But, really nobody's going to notice if you create a pattern. You might notice, but no one else is going to. So the scatter stitch, it's great for filling in backgrounds, and it's really just a straight stitch. But you'll see I'm still keeping my needle on top. I am not going up and down. Just keep moving it from area to area. All right, I'll knock that off later. One other thing that I like to do is to create some simple shapes. I will create little boxes. And my boxes are always a little bit wonky because I'm not marking them, but that's okay because it's hand stitched, and it's not, what I do is definitely not embroidery. So you can create little boxes, you can create little triangles, you can scatter these shapes all over your work. It's really fun. And sometimes I will work it as a satin stitch and make a little box in a satin stitch just by stitching some railroad tracks really close together. And these are fun when you do them in variegated thread. Well, they're fun in solid color thread too. Quite often I will just scatter them across a surface and do them the same way I do the ricing by changing directions, and they look a little bit like confetti. Quite often when I'm doing this ladder, railroad tracks, whatever you want to call it, I will vary the height of them, the width of them, make them more wonky. There's just so much you can do with just this very simple straight stitch. So go spend some time this week just playing around with straight stitch and see what's your favorite way to use it.